If you wish to review the recorded presentation, go to our Facebook page and look for Facebook Live during the meeting, or find the video link on our feed later. We have a small poll that we will post for you to fill out, basically asking where you are from and how did you find out about the program. Give you a few minutes to complete that.
We ready?
Not yet. Next slide.
He's sharing the folder is upside down.
John, next slide.
Oh, okay. Well, this is having a garden question. That's
Right.
Ed's slide to talk about how to reach us. But if you're ready to start the presentation, we'll start.
Not yet. If you have gardening questions at any time, please contact us. The UC Master Gardeners of Amador County are working by phone and email to answer your questions. You can contact us by phone 209-223-6838, by email mgamador@ucanr.edu, on Facebook at UCCE Amador MG. If you're not located in Amador County, we strongly recommend that you direct your questions to your local Master Gardener program. You'll find them by doing a web search for UCCE Master Gardener and your county name. Okay, housekeeping is done for now. I'm going to turn over control to our presenters for today, Mr. John Otto and Mr. Hack Severson. John, it's your turn.
Good morning. My name is John Otto, and I've been an Amador Master Gardener since 2005. And also we have Hack Severson.
Hi.
Hack's been an Amador County Master Gardener since 1996. That's 24 years. Anyway, today we're going to talk about home orchards and particularly apples and pears. So this is basically the information. Can you get rid of that on the big screen? Okay. Oh, well, I'm still looking. You want me to look at this one? Oh, excuse me. Okay. I better do it over here though. No, I'm having trouble with it. Okay, are we ready? We're in sync. This is not rotating here. I have to be doing it down here, I guess. Yeah. This doesn't help me up there. Yes, it does. Okay. Sorry for the delay. Anyway, this class is about your home orchard and apples and pears in particular. So again, I've introduced myself as John Otto, and we have Hack Severson. Let's move right along. These are the topics we're going to talk about, a general introduction, and then we'll get into more specifics about apples and pears. So we're Amador County, and if you're not in Amador County, this is what we look like. We have a great diversity of elevations from about 300 to over 10,000 feet elevations. But mainly most of us grow our orchards in that 300 to about 3,500 elevation. That's very similar to a very popular apple area called Apple Hill, which is near Camino and El Dorado County, just to the north of us. And they're between 3,000 and 3,500 for the most part, and get snow a couple times a year. So we'll have to remember this chill area when we talk about chill hours later in the class. So what type of orchard trees will you be considering? Well, there's lots of orchard trees, and we have the stone fruit class, which has got your plume, cherries, nectarines, peaches, and plums. You also have nut crops, okay? Actually, the almond is considered a stone fruit, and we just actually eat the nut. I don't know too many people who are growing walnuts, or excuse me, pecans, but quite a few people grow walnuts in Amador County. And then you have the citrus class of orchards, and we're not going to really talk about them, but they do fairly well in some of the middle part of this county, and that 2,000, under 3,000 elevation. But we have pole fruits we're going to talk about today. I had some background noise. Anyway, the pome fruits are basically the apples and the pears. It also includes pomegranates and quince. And that's what we're going to talk about. And I mentioned El Dorado County has the Apple Hill area, a very popular place where people go every fall. And it was actually could have been Pear Hill if you know the history, because they grew more pears in El Dorado Camino area up until the 60s. But the fire blight disease that attacks pears more prevalently than apples kind of decimated that orchard practice. So now El Dorado County has Apple Hill, and it's probably the #1 commercial, at least touristy wise, apple area in California. And they have the largest concentration of growers in California as well. So a lot of the information that a local homeowner might want for an orchard can be found in a really good publication that's put out by the Ag and Natural Resources part of the UC system. This is it right there. It's publication 3485. That's about the home orchard. Everything we're talking about today and much, much, much more about all sorts of trees can be found in this publication. We'll talk more about it later. So apples and pears are what? Okay, they're pome fruits. That's a classification of fruit. It's a fleshy, leathery core, and when you cut it open, you'll see that there's a group of 5 seeds in a star pattern. That's indicative of the pome fruits. Pears are very similar. Stone fruits have pits, so that's why they're in a different class. They're not apples or pears. And you can see, like I said, an almond is actually a pome fruit class, but you eat the nut or the pit. Then there's also apples and pears. They're not a berry. Tomatoes are a berry family, and so are citrus. Okay, and we're not talking about any of those that you might have in your orchard. What we are going to talk about is apples and pears. Let's start with the apples. They're in a botanical class called Malus domestica, okay? And they're related to a fruit called the Malus cerevisiae, which is out of the Caspian Sea area. That's where it originated tens of thousands of years ago. The propagation to this country is far, far more recent. So here's some facts. You can look at these. There's a website that you might want to note right there, and while I'm talking, you might write it down. It's a website for the University of Illinois, where apples are king. That's where John Chapman, Mr. Johnny Appleseed, during the late 1700s and early 1800s, traveled from the East Coast all through the Iowa, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois region, planting, giving away free seeds. That brought a lot of the varieties of apples west. We eat a lot of apples, just a top fact, about 17 pounds a year of fresh apples and a whole lot more we do in processed apple juice and ciders, etc. And, they are healthy. They're really high in a lot of good nutrients, and they were used medicinally back in the days. Let's move on. Hack, what are pears?
Pears are typically not found in the wild, of course, and they originated from the Middle East, but not from the Middle East, but the Far East, closer to what we'd consider China today. They're not European. There's both two types, the European pears and the Asian pears. Some pears are elongated, but not all. Some of them are oval and are like apples, And basically, some of them are actually called apple pears. Much like apples, pears were introduced to North America in the early 1600s when people brought them with them. Today, China is producing probably the most world's pear production. Let's start with some planning that all home orchards should address. Starting with site selection. Home orchards really need minimum of 5-6 hours, but preferably more hours of sunlight. Soil's critical. That's the bread and butter of an orchard planting. It's good to know that below the surface is either good soil or maybe not so good soil. There is a particular website that I would recommend to you. It's the USDA data source on soil. But why don't you just start digging in your soil and see what kind you have? That's more important than anything. Remember that the important thing with most gardens, whether it's orchards or vegetables or fruit or whatever it might be, is good drainage. The zoning area that you live in becomes very important also. What are zones? Two sources of zones. The USDA zone chart that you can run into, or the Sunset Garden climate zones. Most of the sunset zones are the 7 to 9 in our area, and the U.S. agricultural zone categories run from 7 to 9 also. Orchard planning.
Well, that's for me. I'm sorry.
That's for you.
We're back over here. So if you watched some of the Amador County classes, we had one in September, just last month, where Dennis Mills talked about pruning fruit trees. And in that class, you learned about how to keep a standard tree much, much shorter. But typically, a standard tree or a dwarf tree or semi-dwarf have various natural heights. And the standard can get up to about 30 feet. Dennis showed you how you could keep the standard down under 8 or 10 feet. So why do we care whether it's a standard or a semi-dwarf or a dwarf? Well, each of those different types of trees, okay, have different health advantages. And the standard is a much stronger tree than a dwarf. But anyway, we control our size by pruning intermittently. So when you're selecting a tree, it's a bare root or it's in a container. But in each case, it would be nice if you can check for these qualities in the root structure, that they have enough length in their root structure and that they're fairly well configured. Unfortunately, in a bare root, it's usually in a bag or in a container, it's in a pot. Some nurseries will allow you to actually open up the bag or pull a plant out of a pot, so you can check that. The size on a bare root is usually a little smaller that you want to pick in diameter of the trunk than it would be for a container. So if you have an opportunity, also look at the health of the graft. So what is the graft? And I can't move the slide. There we go. The graft is the area from the rootstock, which we'll talk about a little bit later, to the actual tree, the transition. Because almost every fruit tree, walnuts as well, have a healthy root system, but you put the fruiting part of the tree grafted onto the top. So when you go to plant either out of a pot or out of bare root, there's a couple things you want to take into consideration. And that's a list we're looking at now. First, you want to make sure that the hole is not super large. Years ago, it was like make a huge hole, put a lot of new soil in it that's loose, let the roots just go crazy. Today, we advocate basically the sooner the tree gets used to its surrounding soils, the better. So the hole shouldn't be much larger than the tree itself. The sides can be loosened and should be loosened so that the new tree root system will actually gravitate that way. Excuse me. And the tree itself should be elevated enough that it's not going to be in a bowl where it sits and soaks and rots. So you need to plant a tree a little higher than the adjacent soils, and you need to make sure the graft is facing away from the sun, north or northeast, so that it doesn't get burnt. Once you have that in, and there's going to be some settlement, we do advocate you put a ring around it out about 3 feet away, but so that you can actually keep a water basin, but make sure that it's set at the crown of the root where it meets the soil. I think that's pretty much all the simplicity of planting almost any tree, but in particular fruit trees. So make sure when you do your annual maintenance that you try and protect for sunburn. And we advocate you paint the trunks with a water and about a 50-50 mix of a white latex. That's an interior latex, not a gloss or semi-gloss or an exterior. And that'll, because they won't breathe if it's gloss, but that'll protect the trunks from sunburn. We advocate you keep an area around an orchard clean of a lot of rotting or debris. When you water, we advocate deep watering. Depends upon your soils. You need to know how porous the soils are going to be and how quickly they drain. But essentially, watering every day is not advocated. Once you get trees established, you won't need to water, but maybe once every couple of weeks. During the first couple of years, you might want to make it once a week or twice a week. Fertilizing, going into a summer schedule, early fall or late summer is 1 before it goes into dormancy. And then in the spring, you want to do some fertilizing. You'll have to study that by the nature of each of the tree. Apples and pears work pretty well. Some of the other fruit trees you might have in your, or nut trees in your orchard might do a little bit different mixes of fertilization. Don't need a lot of nitrogen once a tree is established. Pruning, we've talked about it a little bit. You can prune it for shape and size and maintenance, and also just to open up your trees and give it more air circulation, make it healthier. A lot of tight foliage and moisture causes fruit to rot. Dormant spray is a process of preventing a lot of diseases, of the overwintering of insects that would harbor and/or bacterial or fungals. So dormant spray is an annual ritual. We used to have a lot of copper. It did really well. A lot of the dormant products now have environmentally been reduced. They use a lot more oils instead of coppers. Frost issues in your orchard depends upon your microclimates. And even though we talk broad brush about what might grow in a certain elevation, in a gully or on a ridge top, you're going to have different problems. So frost is in the foothills, we have frost issues almost in every microclimate. So you've got to find ways to learn about your orchard site and make sure you can either cover your trees or provide some fans, or just don't put them where they don't get some air movement. Again, thinning. Most trees and apples and pears will do what's called self-thinning. After the bloom and the fruit set, they actually get to the point where they want to drop some portion of the cluster. But typically, if you have groups of 5 or 6, you should thin your apples and pears out to be 6 or 8 inches apart. It's kind of hard to want to do that because you want to have every piece of fruit you can get off of that tree. But in reality, if you can thin them back, okay, to 4 or 5 per cluster, 3 or 4 per cluster, you'll get larger and healthier and tastier fruit. So fertilization we talked about briefly. For apples and pears, again, especially when they're young trees, early in the spring and then late fall. Again, I emphasized once before, you don't need to have as much nitrogen. What you might find a shortage of is potassium and phosphates. And actually, when you're planting a tree, I was going to make a mention, very often in the foothills, we recommend you put some potassium at the bottom of the hole and cover it with some soil to increase the potassium in your soils. Let's see, what else have I missed? Hack, you want to start talking about what do we think about when we're picking out varieties?
Yeah, kind of as a summary on pears, some of the things you need to consider is the chill hours. We'll be talking about that a little bit later. The rootstocks are the part of the tree that's under the ground, of course, and consideration of the years to production. Some are shorter than others. But chill hours are important. What are chill hours? It's the winter period of time when the tree is in dormant stage. The chill hours are basically calculated as the number of hours that are below 45 degrees and above 32. So that's the critical thing to consider in what kind of a rootstock you need to consider also. Basically in our county, we're talking about 800 chill hours in Jackson, and Ione and Jackson's 1,000, Pioneer's up to 1,600 feet. And even higher elevations might require a consideration of a tree at 1,800 hours. Looking at chill hour zones, you can see that as you're in the valley, you're at zone 1, and it moves up as you go up into the higher elevations. Do your own research. Realize that you may have unique microclimates. I know of some areas in Amador County that you would consider them to be in a zone 3, but actually they drop down into an area that's zone 2, and you could plant citrus. Rootstocks. Okay, what is a rootstock? The rootstock is obviously the part that's under the ground and below the graft. And typically there's a graft between a rootstock and the particular variety that you're planting. M111 seems to be the best, although there are other rootstocks available in the apple area as well as the pears. In the pear area, the winter Nellis and 2 other varieties are prevalent. One is what they call OH 97 or 87, and some other varieties are also available. Apples with M111 rootstock do well in the foothills and the sandy clays in the drought-prone areas. We see a greater variety of rootstock in the pear varieties. And the OHF was found to be the resistant to fire blight, but was also self-infertile. You need to be patient when you plant fruit trees. They're not going to give you fruit the next year. Some of them you'll have to wait 3 to 5 years, some 4 to 7 years. Pears are a little longer than the apples. Semi-dwarf trees are shorter periods of time. Dwarf trees are even shorter, but the climate and the soils are the big determinator. Okay, let's talk about neglected orchards. And this is definitely a major neglected tree. But it takes many years to get to this condition, sometimes 15, 20, 30, 50 years. But some of them are still producing good fruit. But you notice on this particular example that it's still able to produce. But notice the limbs. It hasn't been pruned, and that's the bigger problem. So you need to improve your branch pruning plan. And as Dennis Miller mentioned, you need to really concentrate on that branch pruning and structure pruning. And never, on a neglected tree like this, don't prune back more than 1/3 of the branches maximum per year in order to get that tree back in shape. Pollination, another critical factor. You need to check if your apple or pear variety are self-pollinating or need to be near a pollinizer tree. I have a pear tree, And I don't have another pollinator pear tree with it, but I have an apple tree that's very close by that has a blooming time period, the same as my pear, and they get along fine. Pollinators are critical, and they're critical to the blossom time. You'll notice that some of the, on this chart, if you can see the details here, that most of the fruit trees take a different pollinator. And many trees can pollinate with another tree, but with a few exceptions. But check the blossom time. I happen to have an apple tree that blossoms next to the same time as my pear tree, and they get along fine. And I've grafted on, of course, other varieties that help the blossom sharing time with other varieties.
Let's talk about diseases for a minute. Let's talk about diseases. Pears and apples do share some similar problems that you have to watch out for, like a pear scab is similar to an apple scab and whatnot. But perhaps in apples, the worst thing we have in the foothills I've experienced is the codling moths. And again, depending on how well you're successful doing dormant spray during the dormant season, you can control codling moths, and then they're controllable with traps and other things. Fire blight is less prevalent with apples than it is with pears. It's a really devastating disease, bacterial disease with pears. Then we have some lesser, at least in my experience, lesser infestations of woolly aphids or apple maggots. I have had some problem with the sooty blotchy part on the pear tree. And pear decline is also a rootstock issue. And I haven't had any problem with that, but all the trees I've worked with have all had good hardy rootstock systems. Fruit maturity. So some varieties are early in the season. Some varieties bear flower and then bear fruit mid-season and late season. Here's a list of some of the typical common varieties, and you'll find the earlier ones are like Gravestine and Galas, then the middle of the season, and some of them have very long seasons. Your Jonathan and your Honeycrisp, they go all the way from mid to what we consider late. And then some actually go into December. I have a small Arkansas black tree, and I'm picking fruit at Christmas, okay? And the same with pears. They have the early mid and late season varieties. So for more information about, what varieties are available, talk with the old timers. I mean, we have some very unusual orchards in Amador County that were planted in the 1912s, 10s, 12s, and then up to the 20s. And they have some very unusual varieties. I'll show a few of those in a minute. But essentially, the more common ones are, at least recently, Fuji and Gala Honeycrisp apples are really popular. They keep well and they taste delicious. I'm trying to grow one myself in a neighbor's yard. Granny Smith is that green cooking apple. It's been popular for forever. So those are kind of a short list of very popular ones today. So let's talk specifically about those and then some others. So I'm just going to let you look at some of this, but the key item of information we're talking about is chill hours and when you want to have the fruit. So take the Honeycrisp. It's a good firm apple, has great flavor, stores well. It needs to be pollinated by another tree. From that, go back to the tree chart that Hack talked about. Find out what other trees you have to have in the proximity, or your neighbor's yard. You can get your neighbor's pollinator trees to help you out if you don't have as much room for having pollinizer trees. The thing to look here is, okay, Honeycrisp, they like about 800 to 1,000 hours of chill a year. So you don't have to be real high. Okay, they'll do just fine. But down in the valley, the San Joaquin Valley, where you have like under 300, not likely a good place to do honeycrisp. Same with the galas. Galas, you know, you can do it down in the warmer climates because they only want about 500 hours of chill a year. It's all they need to set their fit. And you know what a gala tastes like. It's really great apple, and it's a good pollinator for others. Let's see what I got to rotate. So then we talk the pink ladies. They're also very popular recently in the last 10 years, 15 years. And the Fuji, it's a good standout. The pink lady and the Fuji are in the mid kind of range, about 400 chill hours for a pink lady and about 500 for a Fuji. That's why you see a lot of Fujis in the middle of the foothills. 500 is not too hard to do. Okay, Granny Smith, again, kind of in the mid-range to the low, 400 chill hours. That's a good cooking apple. You see it in a lot of recipes. Also, it's a good self-pollinating tree. John of Gold is another one I kind of like. I don't have one around me, but I like to buy them. And they have a little more chill they want, about 700 to 800 hours. So they work up in the little cooler climates, higher elevations. It's a good mid-season producer. And these are some varieties that you've probably not seen or heard much. You're not going to find them in a nursery very often, but some of them are very, very delicious. And we saw these in some of the old orchards, the ones from the turn of the century up to the 20s. And they're still producing here, what, 60, 70, 80 years later, or 100 years later, excuse me. Anybody ever tasted a Lady Christmas? It's a very late apple, but it's got a nice flavor. And Pippin, we do know Red Delicious. You see those in the markets. Anybody ever planted or tasted a bellflower? It's a small apple, but it's a firm fruit. I'm going to go a little faster. By the way, these two orchards that were abandoned orchards that are still producing are up about 30,000 foot elevation. 3,500 foot elevation. Thanks, Hack. There's a Spitzenberg. Anybody growing a Spitzenberg out there? If you are, I'd like to get some wood scion. We have an annual February scion exchange in Amador County. If you have any of these, I'll call them rare, heritage or what, older varieties of fruit on a tree, then you know what the actual tree is. We'd love to see the scions and that we can identify, so we can continue to, by grafting, propagate some of these older varieties.
As far as pears go, the European pear varieties are probably the more popular ones that we run into. The Bartlett pear is very popular. It's probably considered the best sweet, soft eating pear, but it also bruises easily. So be aware of that. The Boss pear is basically a crisp and more of a baking pear. It's you noticed a little bit different shape, a little more elongated, and the chilling hours are pretty much the same. In fact, the Boss pear and the Bartlett pear are good intermix for pollinating. Again, we emphasize the chill hours. Notice that the Comus pear it comes in either kind of a red or a green variety. It's very juicy. It's probably the sweetest pear you'll find. The Florel pear, by the way, is more firm and tartar type taste and shaped more kind of like an apple. Again, chill hours. Keep in mind that different varieties of Seckel pear and the Anjou, and notice some people will maybe pronounce that a little different, but it is pronounced Anjou. And the Anjou is a great pear. The Seckel pear is probably the best to resist fire blight in pears. And I have had fire blight in my orchard on the pears, and the pear will spread that fire blight to the apples if they're nearby. The Asian pear varieties are a little different. They are very hardy, many times much lower temperature, elevated temperature degrees than you would think of for a pear. The shoju is very hardy, great storage. I mean, months of storage. The tree grows to about 10 feet tall, bears in 1 to 2 years. So you notice that that particular variety is 1 to 2 years, whereas most trees are 4, 5, 6 years before they bear fruit. That particular variety does require 1 to 2 inches of water a week. It's a very water gobbling type pear. Balanced fertilizer is good, but again, avoid high nitrogen content. The Hosui is best tasting, in my opinion. It's down hardy to 25 degrees. It stores well. Interesting thing is it's very high sugar content, about 12%. A very vigorous, floppy spreading type tree. Some of the trees you'll notice are more erect and vertical. And that tree is a spreading, floppy tree all over the place. Mid-season harvest, Bartlett and Shinko are really your best 2 pollinizers. Shinko, sometimes called an apple pear rather than a pear. It bears fruit in 3 to 5 years, good on resistance to fire blight and excellent storage. Shinseki is more of an upright tree. Sometimes you have to prune the tree to kind of keep it spread out because it has a tendency to grow upright. Good storage, however.
Okay. So that's our little overview of apples and pears of the home fruit family, and tips on some of the home orchard criteria that applies to all sorts of trees. And this is a list of references. Obviously, we find them to be, wonderful. We wouldn't put them up there. And you can look at those when you go back to the site. And that pretty much wraps us up here. We're going to let Ed and Maureen talk to you about the survey, and then we'll be back to you with questions and answers.
After today's program, you'll be receiving an evaluation survey at the email that you used to register for this program. We would appreciate it very much if you would complete the survey and return it at your convenience. We'll use this information to improve our future presentations. Okay, on to questions. John and Hack, Maureen will be reading the questions and then you can respond.
Okay, we've got a couple of them. To begin with, could either of you give us some hints on how you control squirrels in your orchard? We put up the IPM, but can you give us any hints that you actually use personally?
It's funny you ask that question, whoever you are. We're just watching the squirrel in my backyard running from walnut tree to where my tomatoes are at. And every year I dig up in the vegetable area that I want, small as it is, walnut trees. I like squirrels to look at, but they are rodents and they are a pest, and they'll move your fruit around. Actually, on fruit trees, I have more problems with birds, and you use bird netting. But squirrels, I don't really have a good answer. I'll let Hack give his effort at it.
Yeah, squirrels are not probably a problem in my orchard area because I have a 7-foot fence around there. But my bigger problem is raccoons, because even though you have a high fence, raccoons can climb the fence, so they become a bigger pest than squirrels in my yard.
All right, thanks. Next, we've got quite a variety.
Unless you are willing to trap them and do something harmful to them, they want your fruit as much as you do. Next question.
Okay, you know me, I've got to throw in, if you trap them yourself, you have to remember that you, depending on your county, restrictions or laws. You are responsible with dealing with the dead squirrel bodies. So just remember that.
Absolutely right.
Next, my fruit trees have fruited and started growing and flowering again. What's up with that? Is that common? It's as if they've started over.
You mean they're producing two sets of fruit in a year, 2 seasons?
Well, it sounds like they're trying. The question says, my trees have fruited and started growing and flowering again. Is this normal?
Um,
Probably not normal, but it can happen. And
Any advice?
a lot of times it pertains to the frost or rain or snow that might be coming. And again, it all depends. That's, I guess, what you can answer.
There is a section in the home orchard reference book that might have a clue to that. It talks about over fertilization. If this is a young tree and you're giving it a lot of nitrogen in its fertilization, it might be shocked into thinking it wants to bloom more than once. But I've not had that experience personally.
I haven't either.
But that's the only explanation that comes to mind at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Next. You sort of alluded to this, but how long will an apple tree produce good fruit? What is its typical life?
Well, commercial orchard people, they'll tear out their pear orchards and whatnot every, I think, 15 years or so. But I'm just telling you, there's viable fruit from orchards that have been neglected in this county in that 3,000 foot elevation, planted in 1912 and then replanted. The King James orchard and the Barton orchard replanted with additional trees in 1920. And they're still, and then they really haven't been managed for probably the last 30 years. And they're producing really good fruit.
I've had my apple trees in my area for 25 years and have seen no deterioration whatsoever. Some of my nectarines and peaches have gone by the board in that period of time, but not my apples or pears. They're still going. Very hardy.
Impressive. All right, thank you, guys. Here's another one. I know we had several people wonder, how far apart can you plant apple and pear trees from each other?
Probably depends on the variety. Minimum of 12 to 15 feet apart, sometimes more, depending on whether you're dealing with a full-size tree or a dwarf tree. Dwarf trees you could probably put at 12 feet apart.
Okay, go ahead, John.
Yeah, even Dennis, with his orchard that was featured in the class last month, and he keeps his trees, the canopy of his trees fairly small, but he still has them spaced out a good 20 feet apart.
Okay, now to piggyback on that, how far apart do they have to be to pollinate each other? You mentioned using your neighbor's tree. So is there a general rule on that?
Yeah, everything I've read talks about, within 30, 40 feet minimum, sometimes closer. But since orchards are 20 feet apart, I have a neighbor that has a Santa Rosa plum, and I have a different variety of plum, and we're probably 80 feet apart, 90, 100 feet apart.
And I had a Bartlett pear that I didn't really have a pollinator too close, but a neighbor did. And so now we're talking like, that was 100 feet. Okay. And I think I got fairly a good amount of fruit. So I'm going to assume that was the pollinator, or excuse me, pollinizer.
Thank you. Now you both mentioned blight. Is there anything you can do to prevent blight, either apple or pear?
Well, the rule of thumb basically is to also do dormant spray, because it's a pear blight's is it a fungal or a bacterial? It's a bacteria.
Yeah.
So you know, if you can control it by dormant spray, great. There are some sprays that are applied and they're covered in these manuals. I'm not going to promote a specific brand of herbicide. But there are some that you can do after you start to see the evidence of fire blight. But in general, once you see it, it's a little late. The best practice is to cut out the fire blight that you do see as soon as you see it, and don't let the leaves fester on the ground where they continue to propagate. Get them in the trash can, get rid of them. That's why you want to clean the area around your trees. So that's the best practice. Cut out what you see.
And be sure to cut below where the fire blight is. You'll see the dark part on the stem of the tree or the branch. And general rule, cut about 8 inches minimum below where that dark black fire blight shows up on your tree. It's a hard decision to do when you're dealing with your tree, but it's necessary to prevent that from spreading.
And please make sure that afterwards you clean your pruning shears.
Yes.
You know, you go take some alcohol base or whatever cleaner you use on your tools and clean those pruning shears as soon as you've done that, so that it doesn't go to the next tree that you prune.
Thank you. You mentioned creating a water basin at the base of your tree. Could you explain that a little bit? And to go along with that, do you use mulch around your trees?
Okay.
Okay.
You
Remember when you plant a tree, John mentioned about putting a basin or a trough basin around the base of the tree. The rule of thumb is keep that basin out at the drip line level of the tree. So when you start with a young tree, you might have one that's 2, 3, 4 feet away from the tree because that's where your drip line is. However, my trees are much larger now and my drip line has been moved a number of times, and it's probably 5, 6 feet out from the trunk of the tree right now.
So that's a drip line ring for slow watering. We talked basically in the planning, you just put a little dam around a new bare root or a new container plant at about 3 or 4 feet. The key though, and yes, and we do advocate every book I've ever read that you put mulch around the base of all of the trees, but stay away from the trunk. So if you're doing a mulch, whatever it is, okay, keep it at least 3 to 4 inches away from any of the trunk, because then you'll harbor diseases that'll get up into the wood and foster up in the tree. But so early on, a basin, always a drip line with a drip line of irrigation. And when the tree gets to be 10 years old or 8 years old or 6 years old, your watering needs on the surface are pretty minimal unless you have extremely porous soil. The root structure by then has got to be down at least 18 inches or so, and they're finding water pretty much on their own, or you have a bad location for your orchard. That's about it. So you're right. Mulch is great. A basin is good for the young part of the tree. Keep your irrigation out at the drip line, but keep any mulches that you put away from the trunk. Did I cover it? Did we get it?
Did we do it?
You did. Thank you. As far as pears go, can you talk about how to determine whether the pears are ripe and or when to actually pick them?
It depends on the pear. A Bartlett pear, you can, if you wait until it's yellow, it's too late to pick. It's overripe. So in some cases, you need to pick the pear at the right time, you might say, and that's an interesting point because we talked about blossom time of the year and picking time of the year. I just picked the last of my Bartlett pears probably 2 weeks ago. Some of the other Asian pears, you pick them by color, others are by firmness.
Apples are a little different. I think you let apples stay on the tree A little bit longer than you will do for pears.
Yeah.
They'll continue to ripen and hold their firmness when they've almost gotten to full, well, they have gotten to full sugar maturity. So you can leave an apple on a tree much longer than a pear. I guess that's kind of a rule of thumb. You can pick some of the apples early and then set them aside in a shady area, and they'll continue to develop a little bit, but not as much as pears. So leave your apples on a lot longer than pears.
Oh, thank you. That's new to me too. Can you recommend, you mentioned some of the older kind of heritage orchards here in Amador, but can you recommend a source for any of these rare varieties of apples and pears, especially anything that would be as old as the Gold Rush era?
No, I mean, I haven't done any like Google research to see if you, like you do with roses, where you can look for heritage roses and stuff like that, or go to old cemeteries. The problem with finding them even in a fruit tree, apple or pear, in an old derelict orchard is nobody may be still living who knew what that was. And somehow that they don't grow with a little stencil on that says, I'm a pippin. Okay, or I'm a Spitzenberg. So it's very hard with fruit trees to know, because an apple, they all look, some of them look an awful lot. A dark red apple can be a Washington, or it can be an Arkansas black. Some with blush can be a whole different varieties. So it's very hard, but we would love to know if you actually have grandfather's tree that you know is a whatever, and you can put the scion wood, keep it fresh in your refrigerator and get us to its next early spring, February or so. We'd love to be able to have some of these that we knew what they were, we can graft onto our other trees.
I have only 4 apple trees, but over the years, I've taken the scion wood or the grafting process, and probably I have 15 or 20 varieties on those 4 trees. And it's kind of interesting to see a Granny Smith, which is a pure green apple, and suddenly in the middle of there is a red apple that I grafted on. So yeah, you can have an orchard that will bear fruit from early until fall, merely by adding different varieties, and still only have 4 trees in your orchard.
I'd like to pigtail on that, because I think I have not done it. I probably won't do it, but I think it would be really exciting for those people who've done the espalier or just multi-grafted trees. Dave Wilson was advocating it in his nursery literature for a number of years, of doing 4, or 5 trees on an espalier or on a single grafted tree. And you could get early, mid, and late season fruit, apples or pears, from that same tree. And then you've got self-pollinating branches on the same tree.
Yeah, you can be picking apples from June through late November, early December, just by that process.
Thank you. I was going to ask you guys to explain a little bit about the grafting, just to let participants know when we're back in our training room in person. Every year we do conduct a hands-on grafting class, and that's the one John was mentioning in the winter, where we ask people to bring in scions or small branches from their trees, and we teach them how to graft. They can go home and have the kind of trees you guys are talking about. Thank you for bringing that up. Now, speaking of apple trees, one of our participants has 2 old apple trees that have fruited. She said, they say every year I have been here. I'm not sure where they live, but this year there was no fruit on either of the trees. Do you have any ideas why? Why would a tree not fruit?
Yeah, some apple trees are what I guess you would call alternating year production. You have trees that will bear heavy one year and bear light, or maybe none the next year. Last year my Granny Smith didn't do anything, and this year it's loaded. My Arkansas Black the same way. The Delicious, my Delicious tree this year is loaded. Last year it wasn't. So alternating years, some trees are prone to do that.
Thank you. Now, here we're back to critters. Do you have any advice on preventing raccoons and or possums from stealing your fruit?
Raccoons have been my nemesis. Like I said, I've got a 7-foot wire fence up around my orchard, and they'll still get in because they can climb anything. I don't know what to do about raccoons. They will knock fruit off the ground. I'll go out every morning and pick up 3 or 4 apples that have been thoroughly munched on by a raccoon.
If you watch the Dennis Miller one that he did about his orchard, and he had some great visuals because it was actually videoed in his orchard. And you can go back on our website and find that class. He did make a mention that since he keeps his trees down under 8 feet, he's able to easily put bird netting on these smaller shaped trees, and he gets a lot of fruit. And he takes his bird netting and tries to bring it back to the trunk. And by doing so, it deters, but won't eliminate the larger rodent or the raccoons, etc. It does work good for the birds, for squirrels and or other large rodents. They'll tear his netting apart if they really want to get to the fruit. But it does help. You can't really practically do that with a large tree, that has a big canopy. You'd have to have commercial people to actually put netting over them.
Yeah, you have to consider that you're sharing with nature, your supply of fruit.
Thank you. And just to remind our participants, if you have trouble with pests in your garden, you can go to the UCIPM website, and we have put the links a couple times in the chat for various pests, but there's a wide variety of good advice on how to deal with different pests in your garden. Now, your next question, guys, has to do with the dormant or the spraying of pear trees. Can you expand on what and when to spray for pear trees in the dormant season?
Usually, I would say don't spray before a rain. That's the critical thing. Early spring, before the blossoms come, after the leaves start appearing on the tree, but primarily early spring.
The textbooks basically tell you, in dormant spray, what we're trying to do is protect the bark surfaces from harboring bacterial growth or pest growth that'll overwinter. And actually, the books I read, we do your dormant spray a little earlier. November, December, that's too early. But when we say winter dormancy, we're talking about getting into January as well. So, and once you start to see the buds start to push, we call it push, off the branches and start like in April or March, that's way too late. So you've got a fairly small window. Some people will start dormant spray in December. I typically advocate January, February, and March. And if you can, depending upon your weather and your microclimates, try to do it twice. If we have a lot of good rains and you dormant spray in January, you have another opportunity in March.
Yeah, the rain will wash some of it off and make it ineffective.
Yeah, thank you. Now, are you talking
And we
about
would say
using?
that dormant sprays have changed quite a bit over the last 40 years.
Thank you.
And they use a lot of oils more now.
Thank you, John. That's what I was going to ask you. You're talking about like a horticultural oil. Is that what you mean?
Correct. Right.
Oh,
If you
okay.
read the labels, they're intended to dormant, hold on to the branches. And you need to make sure you get on all the surfaces. So it can be a fairly time consuming to make sure you get under the branches as well as on top.
And as far as spraying, the codling moth, they come on 2 or 3 series during the early spring. So you may have to repeat control of your codling moths because they will come 2 or 3 times into the spring.
And they make traps for those.
Yeah, there are traps.
Thank you. We had another question about rats eating the fruit, but I think you guys have pretty much covered that. And then Tracy put the link in the chat room for the pest note on rats, so
Okay.
people can get more detailed info. Now you mentioned, is it possible, I'm not sure about working your PowerPoint. Can you put up the pollinizer tree chart again, or should we just is that possible? Or should we recommend they go to?
No, we can do it. Yeah, we can, you know,
You can go online
yeah,
and ask for pollinizers or pollinating, and you will find dozens of different charts, some more complex and simple than others. But they're usually a cross-reference here with the list of apples on the left-hand side and the same list going across the top. And then you'll see the matching, whether it's a yes or a no.
this particular chart, if you're second from the bottom, it's a Spartan apple. And, you know, will it, if you need it to be fertilized, will a Brayburn do it? Yes. Will a Fuji do it? Yes. Will a Gala do it? Yes. You go over to a Jonna Gold, will not help for pollinate a Spartan. That's the way these kind of charts work. Again, strongly recommend the Home Orchard book by the Ag and Natural Resources. It is for $25. It's the really best book I've ever seen on all the trees, all the nuts,
Yeah.
citrus even.
John, on your chart, Johnamac and Macintosh, you have an X. What does that mean?
I have an X.
Yes,
Which one, Macintosh?
I see the
Johnamac,
Macintosh. I don't see an X.
go to the bottom of the Macintosh.
Oh, for that chart, I don't know what it means. Oh, yeah, it's right here. Yeah, right here. And,
Oh.
but, I'm one of our observers is really observant.
Yeah,
I had seen that before and I have no explanation.
Okay.
probably a misprint.
Maybe.
Okay, next, thanks guys. This is an apple tree question. I have an apple tree that is at least 40 to 50 years old. It's a green variety, but the fruits are all brown and rusty and they're not tasty. Do you know how to identify the variety and or how to improve the taste?
No, maybe Hack in his
The
experience. has a-
only thing I could think of is Google and on apples and varieties and whatever it looks like, and see what they come up with, because I've never seen that issue before.
If it used to be green, if she remember, or they remember that the fruit used to be a green, like a Gavenstein, and now it's turned kind of rusty, it could be or rust is a bacteria. So it could be a bacterial thing that's turning the fruit. If it's rough, like sandpaper surfaced, it might be a disease.
Yeah, it could be a modeling.
This isn't part of the question, but if it is a disease, can it be fixed?
Let me back up just for a second. So again, I don't know if this is a local person or somebody distant, but in any case, if you take photos and or a sample to your local master gardeners, and there are master gardener extensions in every county in this state of California. If they have the physical example, it's much easier to do the research to try and find out what's going on, and include either photos and or the sample of the limb, okay,
Or the fruit.
as well as the fruit. So then, what was the next question?
No, that was it. That's great
Yeah.
advice. But we
And-
do have another question. You have quite a few. Okay, one comment for me. We have a question about getting the grafting scions, but I think, John, you've already mentioned that. I would advise them to keep an eye on our website the first of the year and see whether we're going to be able to have an in-person class or whether we're going to do it online. But that has been one of our traditional classes. So that's a little up in the air right now.
It's a little hard to do grafting classes.
Yeah.
remote.
Yeah, so,
You
but
need to let
even,
the person have some hands-on experience.
If I can have just a second though, to talk a little bit about scion.
Thanks,
If
John.
you're going to be pruning your trees this December or January, and then you think about scion later, you don't really have any leftover wood. But when you're doing that late winter pruning or whatnot, if you've already done your summer pruning and that's it for the year, then you're too late to save any scion unless you have new growth. But if you're doing your pruning in December or January, you can take those stems that are the size of a pencil up to 3/8 of an inch or so and cut them into 18-inch lengths or whatnot. Put a moist rag or paper towels around the end, put it in a plastic bag, put it in your refrigerator, and it'll keep all the way up to April. And most jurisdictions that have scion exchanges, they're in February or March before April, because you want to do your grafting in February or March or in April sometimes, but that's pretty late before things actually go in bloom, because it's not good to do any grafting after the trees are in bloom.
Other than the graft, yeah.
Yeah, you want to do all your grafting when everything's pretty dormant. But the time to save the scion is several months beforehand.
Maureen, before you start the next question, go through the questions and start to wrap it up because we're running out of time, okay?
okay, we'll do that. Let's see. Okay, this one I think would be a good one to go over because you mentioned, you mentioned dormant sprays for apple and pears, but our participant has always used the pheromone traps for the codling moth. And so they're wondering, it's the first time they've heard about actually spraying for codling moths. Can you explain, do we spray for codling moths? Do we use traps? What is the most successful?
During the dormant season, if you use dormant spray, you suffocate the growth of bacteria and the codling moth eggs. Once you're into fruit production and the blossoms, okay, then you have to take care of the codling moth with these traps, pheromone traps.
Yeah.
And yes, so if you can't get them before they develop, then after season, when they actually start to exist, you put out the pheromone traps in the trees. Does that answer the question?
I have
think
sprayed after the blossoms fall.
Okay.
And before the fruit starts to develop and the codling moths become a problem.
And it helps.
It helps, yeah.
For clarification, the dormant sprays will control what? The larva? And then the
Yes.
pheromone traps control the adult moths?
Correct.
That's exactly right.
Okay, so kind of depends where they're at, maybe use both. You mentioned fire blight real quick. Do you put fire blight material into your compost pile?
No.
No.
Thank you, that was
No.
an easy one. Okay,
In
we
fact,
do
there
it
are
with,
some people who have said you don't even put it in your burn pile,
Yes.
that you haul it off to somebody's landfill somewhere. I suspect if you had it in the burn pile, it should destroy the bacterial, but maybe it's not a good idea to even put it in a burn pile.
Last week,
Not in compost.
last week I cut off some fire blight off one of my trees. And I mean, it was a 1-inch branch and it kind of killed me to do that, but I had to do it to save the tree.
thank you. Okay, one more on irrigation. Could you clarify, did you say to keep the irrigation outside of the tree drip line?
No.
At the drip line,
Yeah.
At the drip line?
at or outside, slightly outside the drip line, either one,
Okay, but not up close to the base of the tree?
never.
All right. Okay, well, I think we're gonna wind this up, although we have a comment from one of the participants about identifying your apple tree. apparently you can contact UC Davis, kind of like what you're saying, John, and UC Davis can do some testing to figure out what kind of tree it is.
I had actually heard that. I just don't know how you get connected with, I should know, but we don't know how to get connected with the right people.
There's a link in the chat. If people are interested, they can look real quick, and we can also put some of this information out on our line. Okay, let me look real quick. We have, you guys have a lot of questions. Looks like some of these. Okay, I'm outside of Moke Hill. All right, here's one. Okay, this one's kind of a couple things. I'm outside, this is local for us. I'm outside of Moke Hill. How can I get more specific chill hours for my new property? I know there's a lot of microclimates over there. I am planning a first orchard with bare root trees in December, January. Any advice?
Again, you may be on a microclimate, you may be on a ridge. If you've had the property long enough that you've actually kept tabs of the weather, for a couple seasons, you can get a feeling about how many hours, you can do that. How many days do you think you would be below 45 but above 32? You can have your own data, or go to the ag extension right there in San Andreas, or at the government center, and ask them if they have some specific weather data for Glencoe or wherever you're at near McCollum Hill.
Also, Tracy provided a good resource for calculating chill hours.
Yes.
It's a website. We'll go ahead and post that too when we post the presentation.
Very good, very good.
Yeah, there's a number of good links in this. Okay, Doris, I think, guys, we could go on all day asking you questions. Want to thank you very much for your expertise. I'm going to turn it over to Doris.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
No problem. Before we all leave, we will go through the rest of the questions, and we'll try to get back to everybody who has sent us a question with a follow-up answer. So, and we'll be sending it to the email that you registered with.
A lot of questions.
Cool. I think that's it, guys. Thank you so much for attending.
Are we disconnected, Ed?
We are done, and